This is the presentation video for the MECH 421 term project, detailing the modal analysis done on the Creality Ender-3 V2 3D printer base. The objectives of the modal analysis performed on the printer base were to create a vibrational model of the system, identifying the natural frequencies and mode shapes, and to combine that knowledge with a theoretical model to approximate the stiffness of the structure in various directions. To achieve these objectives, the following steps were taken. A theoretical model of the printer base was created, using the degrees of freedom the physical structure would be evaluated with. Then, modal testing was performed on the structure and experimental frequency response functions, or FRFs, were attained. After that, several forms of identifying the modal parameters from the data were employed to analyze the structure. And then lastly, the experimentally obtained actual frequencies were used to approximate the spring constants in a theoretical model.
Before performing any testing on a physical system, a theoretical model of the printer bed was created. This system was modeled as a thin plate with 8 springs. 4 of these springs were placed on the sides of the print bed, and the remaining 4 were placed on the bottom 4 corners of the bed. Each of these springs were paired with a damper, which are excluded from the diagram for simplicity. For the analysis of the 3D printer build plate, 5 degrees of freedom were considered. The 5 DOFs are translation along the X, Y, and Z axis, and rotation about the X and Y axis. Using the energy method, the equations of motion were obtained for the system. The base plate of the printer was then weighed and measured, allowing for its moments of inertia to be calculated. For initial testing, an arbitrary stiffness value was assigned. This allowed our equations of motions to be completed, finally allowing for the theoretical FRFs to be created for the printer bed.
So, in accordance with the theory behind rover accelerometer testing, modal testing in the printer base required excitation of 1 degree of freedom with measurements taken at all 5 degrees of freedom. With the limitation of only 3 accelerometers, this required 2 rounds of testing and measurements. Here, both tests excited the system in the Z direction with the use of an impulse hammer. For the first round of testing, accelerometers were placed to measure along the x-axis and 2 to measure along the z-axis. The 2 accelerometers recording data in the vertical direction are positioned on opposite sides of the x-axis to be later processed for rotation about the x-axis. For the second round of testing, accelerometers were placed to measure along the y-axis and 2 to measure along the z-axis, this time on opposite sides of the y-axis. From these measurements, data for translation about the y-axis, z-axis, and rotation about the y-axis could be obtained. Additional measurements were also taken, exciting and measuring the system on the x and y axis.
From the experiment, 12 FRFs were generated, the most insightful being excitation in the z direction measured along the z-axis, about the x-axis, and about the y-axis, excitation in the x direction measured along the x-axis, and excitation in the y direction measured along the y-axis. By analyzing the frequencies that peaks in the FRFs occurred, the natural frequencies of the printer base were approximated. The 5 modes of the multi-degree of freedom system were found to be at 30 Hz, 22 Hz, 40 Hz, 15 Hz, and 55 Hz, listed in order of prominence. More accurate analysis of the mode shapes was then done by generating the complex mode indicator function, or CMIF, from the data. For the CMIF, the first column of the FRF matrix, containing entries corresponding to excitation in the Z direction, was used. The following figure was generated. In the CMIF, the 5 most prominent resonant frequencies were 10 Hz, 15 Hz, 28 Hz, 22 Hz, and 60 Hz. Of these frequencies, 3 of them were previously identified by evaluating the experimental FRFs. The 3 frequencies being 15 Hz, 22 Hz, and about 30 Hz. Additionally, the 5th point of resonance found in the CMIF, 60 Hz, is close to the 55 Hz natural frequency previously identified. The final method of modal analysis used was transfer function fitting via MATLAB's System Identification Toolbox. Initially, the analysis was attempted using the original data, but it then became evident that the resolution at the low frequency modes was not sufficient to obtain meaningful results. This is due to an impulse hammer being used as the excitation method as opposed to a shaker, which performs better at low frequency ranges. Instead, previously collected data of the printer's response to sine sweep excitation in the x direction was provided and analyzed. 2 transfer functions were fitted to the data, one with 5 modes, shown in green, and one with 3 modes, shown in purple. The modal parameters of the 2 transfer functions can be seen in the table. All analysis methods clearly found modes at about 25 Hz, 40 Hz, 50 Hz, and 60 Hz, with an additional mode in the 5 to 15 Hz range.
The resonant frequencies were then used to approximate the spring constants for the theoretical model. This was accomplished by manually adjusting the stiffness constants of the 8 springs until the peaks in the theoretical FRF matched the frequency and magnitude found experimentally. The best match was achieved with the listed spring constants. The resulting theoretical FRFs can be seen in the figure on the screen.
So what we've done here for this report is we've identified the modal parameters of our Creality Ender-3 V2 3D printer. We first started by building a theoretical model. We then went into the lab and performed some hammer tap tests using Cut Pro with assistance from the TAs. With the experimental FRFs from those tap tests, we performed a single value decomposition, and we also fitted transfer functions to the data, both in MATLAB. From there, we found the mode shapes, natural frequencies, spring rates, and damping ratios. We also outlined steps for future work and identified errors on our analysis. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please reach out to the email on screen.